Millennials may be the first generation since the Great Depression to not do better financially than their parents. So let's take a look today at the 5 main reasons why millennials are completely financially screwed. Number 1, the housing crisis. Housing prices soared over the past few decades, just as millennials were graduating college and starting their career. This has made it difficult for millennials to enter into the housing market at the same age that their parents did several decades prior. And before the pandemic and the ensuing inflation crisis, things were already looking pretty bad, but they've actually only gotten worse. Because as if the rise in average home prices in desirable neighborhoods wasn't bad enough, there's actually now a double whammy with the increased interest rates and the rising cost of borrowing. As central banks around the world have increased interest rates to try to tackle the inflation, mortgage rates have also gone through the roof. And if we look at this chart, we can see that the median monthly mortgage payments went from below $600 per month to over $2,350, with the vast majority of that amount going towards interest, not paying down the principal. And despite the fact that mortgage rates and the cost to borrow have gone through the roof, we haven't seen that much of a decrease in the actual price of real estate. Things have come down a little bit since the peak maybe a year or 2 years ago, but there has not been a dramatic decrease yet, at least, in real estate asset prices. So we still have elevated real estate prices, and the cost to borrow and the cost to enter is much higher. And what this means is that people looking to enter the real estate market now can afford even less than they could have a couple years ago. They need to have way more in terms of a down payment, and the monthly cost to buy a home is way higher than it used to be. And this seems hard to imagine given how in some places run-down bungalows are now considered to be multi-million-dollar homes. And so the result of this is that fewer millennials between the ages of 25 and 35 today are homeowners than any of the generations that preceded them. And since home ownership and real estate investments are, generally speaking, one of the largest asset classes and something that a lot of people rely on for retirement and financial stability, the fact that millennials have been unable to get into the market at the same rate that their parents or their grandparents did means that they are worse off financially. But that's just reason number 1. The second reason that millennials are financially screwed is education inflation, both meaning that the cost to get education has gone through the roof, but also the amount of degrees and diplomas and qualifications that you need just to get an entry level or a simple job has also gone through the roof. For starters, it's been well documented that the amount of education you need just to get a basic entry level job has gone up and up and up over the last few decades, to the point where it's getting ridiculous and people are asking for 5 years of experience and multiple degrees just for an entry-level position. But as if the education inflation in that sense wasn't bad enough, the actual cost to get those degrees and diplomas has also gone up. So let's take a look at the cost of a basic education, so a bachelor's degree from university. In the US, boomers used to be able to pay for a university education, a 4-year degree with an average of 306 hours of minimum wage work. If you compare that to today with millennials, it costs them on average over 4,400 hours of minimum wage work to pay for that same 4-year university degree. And so because of that massive mismatch, the only way the millennials have been able to get the education they need to get a decent job is to take out loans, so student debt. And as we can see in this chart here, young Americans have never shouldered a higher student loan burden. The amount per capita on average of student loans just keeps going up and up. And with interest rates currently so high, the debt service cost of that historic amount of student loan debt is also high, and that is just yet another reason why millennials are struggling to get ahead. Reason number 3 why millennials are falling behind financially is the rising cost of living. Now, this is affecting everybody regardless of which generation they're from, but you can chalk this up as another L in the L column for millennials. Because just when people were hitting their stride in their careers and maybe considering entering the real estate market and were on the verge of making it, all of a sudden you throw in another crisis with the cost of living and the amount of inflation, and everything from gasoline to groceries to housing costs have gone up. And yet again, millennials are stuck treading water financially instead of being able to actually make progress. Now, the first 3 reasons are related to increased costs and expenses and outflows of money for millennials. But now let's pivot to look at income or inflows of money. Because the fourth reason why millennials are financially struggling is that average rates of pay are stagnant even in the face of all of these increased costs. And while millennials may be the most qualified generation in history in terms of the credentials and degrees and diplomas that they have, that is not necessarily translating into increased earnings. If we look at this graph comparing wages and inflation in the US, you can see that through the majority of the past few years, inflation has well exceeded the increase in wages, and it's only really in the last few months that the switch has flipped. But there's still a gap that needs to be caught up. And in fact, millennials are not out-earning their parents at the same age when adjusted for inflation. Previously, in the post-war period from 1940 to 1950, it was pretty much guaranteed that your children would earn more than you did. But now it's only a 50-50 chance. So as if all of those increased expenses weren't enough, the average wages have not kept pace, making that gap or that shortfall even worse. And the fifth and final reason why millennials are going to be left holding the bag when the music stops is that when it comes time for millennials to retire, quite simply, Social Security just will not be able to provide for them in the same way that it has for the previous generations. In the 1950s, there were 17 American workers to support each retiree. But by the time millennials retire, there's only going to be 2. Now, already Social Security in the US is arguably not enough to live on. The average expenses of a retiree exceed $4,000 per month, and the average Social Security check is less than $2,000 per month. But that is today. Over the next 20 years, 10,000 baby boomers are expected to retire on average every single day, which is decreasing the amount of people that are paying into the system and increasing the burden on people drawing from the system. And simply put, something is going to have to give. The Social Security system in the US only has guaranteed funding until 2035, after which point the amount of benefits that people get could drop off a cliff, and it could be even more bleak for millennials when they're looking to retire. Either they're going to have to work longer and later to be able to retire maybe at the age of 70 instead of 65, or they're just simply going to have to provide for their retirement themselves because government assistance programs just might not be reliable. And this demographic ticking time bomb, at least in the US, Canada, and other Western countries, is going to hit millennials hard. Now, these 5 factors paint a pretty bleak picture for the financial future of millennials, especially as they approach retirement over the next few decades. But there are things that you can do now to decrease your reliance on the system and make sure that you are not one of the statistics that I just mentioned. So if you want to find out what those are, then click right here.